Okay, good evening. Today is November the 18th. Right now it is 7:40, and I'm calling to order the special meeting of the Guilford Planning and Zoning Commission. We're not going to follow the regular plan that we follow. We're actually going to, this is a public hearing, and so we're going to have some guest speakers. They're going to have some guest speakers, and then we're going to have some opportunity for public comment. We do have a public notice that we do have to read into the record. Tom Cost has offered to do that. So Tom, it's yours.
Legal notice, Guilford Planning and Zoning Commission. Notice is hereby given that the Guilford Planning and Zoning Commission will hold a public hearing on November 18, 2014 at 7:30 p.m. at the Nathan B. Green Community Center, Guilford Whitfield Room. I think that's wrong. It's the Guilford Room, actually, isn't it? First floor, 32 Church Street, Guilford, Connecticut, for the following purposes. 1. Consider adopting the Town of Guilford Community Coastal Resilient Plan as amended to the Plan of Conservation and Development. Copies of the draft plan are available for inspection in the office of the Planning and Zoning Commission, Town Hall South, 50 Boston Street, Guilford, Connecticut. At this hearing, persons may attend and be heard, and written communications will be received. Dated at Guilford, Connecticut, this 29th day of October 2014. Signed, Richard Meyer, Chairman.
Thanks, Tom. So we are going to have a presentation. First up is going to be George Krell. There will be an opportunity for everybody to speak. We will try to make as much time as possible for that. We are seeking the public's input, and we want to make sure that everyone that's interested knows entirely about this. So, George.
Thank you.
It's yours.
Thank you. Does everyone have a copy of the agenda? Everyone who wants a copy? We'll try to make this presentation expeditious and get to your comments as quickly as possible. Before we get into an introduction. Sure. Matter of fact, I'll turn this on. How's that? Is that better? Okay. Before we get into our presentation, I'd like to introduce Joe Mazza, the town's first selectman, who would like to welcome you all as well.
Thank you, George. Good evening, everyone. Can you all hear me? Yes. Okay, I guess it's turned on. Guilford has recognized the risk, being a coastal community, that we faced, particularly after witnessing two major storms, Irene and Sandy. It really kind of opened our eyes to the risk that we face being a coastal community. Throughout the region, Guilford has now been recognized as a leader in dealing with coastal resilience and sea level rise. As a matter of fact, I was honored to be first selectman during this period, and also had to deal with a lot of uncertainties and a lot of problems in dealing with these storms. But at our COG meeting, which is the Council of Governments, South Central Council of Governments, like I said, I was honored because Guilford was held in recognition of being one of the leaders, being in the forefront of dealing with the problem of sea level rise, and being in the forefront of recognizing that we do have a problem and that we are dealing with the problem. We first started dealing with the problem by having a coastal mitigation committee, and we've applied for a series of grants. But even before that, we recognized that we had a problem with our roads. And we've dealt with that by putting a capital plan together which dealt with road elevations. And over the past summer, we started dealing with some of these road elevations, particularly Old Quarry Road. And then we received a grant for Chatfish Island Road, which we're going to deal with next summer. And we're going to deal with Tunnels Point. And then most recently, we've looked at Falcon Road. These are all coastal roads, the roads that are in peril because of sea level rise. We've also are now monitoring the sea level rise, and we We've dealt with our monitoring the sea level rise. But what we have to consider, and this is important for the zoning folks, the Planning and Zoning Board, because at some point, and you'll see by the presentation that you're going to receive tonight, in years to come, we're not going to have the shoreline that we have now. And it's important because from a financial standpoint, we're going to lose part of our tax base. And the folks who know me well, I'm a financial person. Now, I'm not going to be around, and unfortunately, many of you will not be around. But that's important for the sustainability of our town. So we have to look at our town zoning because the inland properties are going to have to sustain our tax base because the shoreline is going to start to recede. I'm talking years from now. But we have to consider that when we look at zoning. So we have to be very proactive when we look at our zoning regulations. But this is all in the future. But we're starting to look at that, and we have to be proactive. But this plan, I think, is going to cover that, and this is what you're going to hear tonight. Also, this plan has gone through a lot of review. It was presented to the Board of Selectmen just about a year ago. Am I correct, George? And it's also been vetted by our town attorney to make sure it complied with state statute. It then was sent back to our staff and then reviewed again by our town attorney, and it's gone back and forth. So this has been vetted quite a lot. So what you are going to see tonight is the final product that's gone through a series of review through our various regulations and state statute, and is the final product. To the point. The point now, it's your turn. We want your input. We want your comment, and we want your criticism before it goes to my board, the Board of Selectmen, because we have to make the final decision on this plan. It then becomes your plan. So please let us have your comments, let us have your criticisms. And I'm glad you're here tonight. So let us hear from you tonight. And I want to thank the committee. They did a fantastic job. McClone and McBroom, I want to thank you all and all the other participants and our staff, I think, for doing a fantastic job of putting this plan together. It's a well thought out plan. Again, I'm sure it does need some tweaking, and that's why you are all here tonight. So thank you again. Okay, thank you.
I think my colleagues will agree we can skip our presentation now and just move right into the public comment. Thank you, Joe, for doing that. But we won't, since we've gone to great lengths to prepare a presentation for you. So I'm going to flip through a couple of slides with Tim's help, illustrating kind of a little bit of an overview about what this plan entails and the significance of this plan. The project, as Mr. Mazza mentioned, what we're proposing tonight is a community coastal resilience plan. Many of you have seen it. I have a hard copy right here of the phase 3 of the document. It's on the town's website for those of you who would like to read it more carefully after tonight. Or if anyone wants a copy electronically, I'd be happy to send it to you. And we have paper copies also in our office, as the public notice indicated. So if anyone wants to spend more time with this document, please take that opportunity. The purpose of this hearing is to urge the Planning and Zoning Commission to adopt this coastal resilience plan and make it part of the plan of conservation and development of the town. The plan of conservation and development is a multi-document policy statement that guides the decision makers of the town about the future land use and future development of the town in terms of community development, in terms of infrastructure, and in terms of private development. The Coastal Resilience Plan, if this is approved by the Planning and Zoning Commission, and as the first selectman said, also approved by the Board of Selectmen, the Coastal Resilience Plan will become part of the town's plan of conservation and development. And its purpose is to aid the people of Guilford in proactively addressing these coastal challenges, which we all know about and that the first selectman just alluded to, and that are identified in very specific terms in the Coastal Resilience Plan and in the preceding documents that were developed by our consultants and our experts to help us identify what the risks and vulnerabilities to our coastal areas are. So it's based on science, it's based on engineering, it's looking to the future. And the purpose of the plan is to help us ensure that we continue to be a thriving coastal community, to protect our neighborhoods, to ensure public safety, and to create opportunities for citizens and neighborhoods, especially our coastal neighborhoods, to work together to plan for this future. The plan clarifies the risks and vulnerabilities. One of the documents that's part of our comprehensive approach to all of this is specifically identified and calls out the risks and vulnerabilities to our coastal properties and our coastal resources. The plan offers approaches, a menu of approaches to increase our resilience to the threats and the vulnerabilities and the risks associated with coastal storm events and sea level rise. And it enables our leadership to set a model for the future and also to attract resources, financial resources, to address the issues that we have to deal with in the future, and you'll hear more about that. The purpose of this meeting is to, as I mentioned, encourage the Planning and Zoning Commission to adopt this plan, and we and the Commission wants to hear from you tonight specifically to hear what your views are. We're going to try to highlight what the plan entails. The adoption of the plan by the Planning and Zoning Commission and the Board of Selectmen, as I mentioned, creates a policy framework and a recommended set of strategies for future use by the town's decision makers, including Planning and Zoning Commission, including the Board of Selectmen, Hazard Mitigation Commission, and many others. What we'll try to do tonight is talk about that some more. We'll try to answer your questions, and we'll try to continue to generate interest in this ongoing effort. What we're doing tonight is not the end of this process by any means. It's really the beginning of the next phase, which is the actual implementation of the many recommendations and suggestions that are contained in the plan, which you'll again hear more about. Up to this date, we've been working on this project for a little bit over 4 years with our partners, the Nature Conservancy and Yale's Urban Ecology and Design Laboratory. You're going to be meeting in a few minutes some representatives of those two agencies. We've had at least 5 public meetings over the last number of years with representatives of neighborhoods, coastal property owners, and other citizens of the town. We've had 17 town administrative meetings with town department heads, with our staff and our project team. We've created the 3 documents that I mentioned. Risk and vulnerabilities is the first document. A set of options or a description of options is the second document. And the third document is the one we're considering tonight, which is the actual plan recommendations. This project was funded by NOAA, a federal government agency, that enabled us to retain the services of Malone and McBroom, engineers and planners, to help us put the project together and to document all of our work. We've worked with and we intend that this plan would integrate with other planning activities of the town. under the auspices of the Plan of Conservation and Development, including the Hazard Mitigation Plan, which Mr. Mazza alluded to, the Harbor Management Plan, which some of you may be familiar with, the Town Center South Plan, which is a planning document of the Planning and Zoning Commission. So the Coastal Resilience Plan will interrelate with these other planning activities and these other planning works. The adoption of the Coastal Resilience Plan, I want to emphasize this again because it's very important. It does not create any law or create any requirements for town agencies or property owners. What it does is make suggestions and establish policies that we would like to implement or try to implement over the future. It does not create any new requirements in terms of either town agencies or property owners. It does not mandate any zoning changes or any capital improvements. It creates hopefully an integrated framework for developing these tools, including infrastructure improvements and regulatory improvements down the road. Each of those activities has their own process associated with them. Zoning amendments, as most of you know, require that the Planning and Zoning Commission hold public hearings, notify affected property owners, and this plan does nothing to obviate the need to do any of those things. What it does is provide a framework and a justification for making either infrastructure or capital improvements or zoning or regulatory changes down the road, subject to all the normal processes that are part of that. One of our next steps, which you'll hear more about, and hopefully, I know that a number of you represent coastal neighborhoods, one of our next steps is to invigorate and stimulate more planning at the neighborhood level, and you're going to hear some more detail about how that might happen in a few minutes. This plan can offer guidance, encouragement, and support with other town agencies for neighborhood planning efforts, which is a very important part of what we're trying to do. Next slide, please. The Coastal Resilience Plan, as I mentioned, has clarified risks and vulnerabilities to people and places, offers approaches to increase resilience in a number of categories. What we've called technical improvements, technical recommendations that might relate to shoreline protection, roadway alterations. Mr. Moss has talked about a number of those already. Water supply or wastewater improvements, coastal real estate, and coastal structure improvements. The plan will make recommendations and does make recommendations in the regulatory area, as I mentioned, including guidance for land conservation, land acquisition, building code modifications, zoning amendments and overlays, also for acquisition of damaged properties, and discusses other acquisition alternatives. The plan suggests a process for guiding neighborhood improvements, neighborhood design and planning and implementation, and also for further public engagement and collective learning about this whole issue of coastal resilience and sea level rise. And finally, the plan creates opportunities and gives us additional clout, if you will, in attracting and procuring resources for physical improvements, for infrastructure, gives us greater opportunity to find grants, do financing for many of the projects that are identified in the plan and that we might be pursuing in the future. At this point, I'd like to invite Adam Welchel from the Nature Conservancy to come up to the podium and talk to us a little bit about the context of the plan and also to add a little bit more about the funding aspect of all of this. Adam?
Thank you and good evening. Our journey with the town of Guilford began with the origin of our Coastal Resilience Program back in 2007, 2008. And we feel very fortunate and very proud to have had the opportunity to work with the town to develop this plan that's in front of you for consideration today. Since that time, we've worked with over 35 communities in the state of Connecticut, With our Coastal Resilience Program, it's designed to lend a helping hand and to work with communities to walk through a number of steps, including awareness, which we are all keenly aware of, given the impacts of Irene and Sandy and some winter storms, to get into risk and vulnerability and strengths assessment. As George pointed out, that has been a key part of getting us to this point today. Developing options and choices, which again was in that second document, and finally putting it all together into a final package and a final way forward, hopefully for the town of Guilford. And I have to say, having, as Joe pointed out, the first selectman, having worked with the towns that we have, I have to say that Guilford is really a standout in this arena and really is serving leadership for not only adjoining towns such as Madison and Brantford, but also a lot of other towns in the state of Connecticut. This plan is really based on science. Through our work in the Coastal Resilience Program, we were able to bring to bear here in Guilford. Yes.
It's a little hard to hear back here because there's a party next door. Can you speak up a little bit louder?
Yes, thank you. I'm trying to be in my best behavior and keep my tone and tenor even here. So we were able to bring to bear the science of NOAA, the National Oceanic Atmospheric Agency, as well as the folks at NASA and a number of other entities, to really bring the science to bear so that you all have the best information to make important decisions. And this really is some of the underpinnings of this particular plan that is in front of you today. So one of the things that has been mentioned, and I remember at a public meeting, and again, this has been over a number of years, I remember State Representative Pat Willits, who's here today, I remember she stood up and said, those communities that have a plan in place will be at the front of the line when federal funding and state funding is available in the recovery, response, and mitigation after disasters. And we certainly have seen that play out in a lot of communities here in Connecticut, including Guilford. As was mentioned, this plan was actually funded through a competitive grant process back in 2011 in the aftermath of Irene. And there has been quite a bit of monies made available for the region and a number of towns here in Connecticut. And this is really about positioning the actions and the choices that you see in this plan in the context of future funding as it becomes available. So what you're about to take a look at are the actions and choices that have been identified in the plan. As George pointed out, there are a number of categories and a lot of refinement. Again, this has been informed by your input to date. And again, this will only go forward if it's collective and collaborative, and that's really about the underpinnings of what this evening is about and future evenings. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Kevin, who's going to tell us a little bit more about the nuances and the nitty-gritty of the actual actions that you see here. Potential actions, I should say.
Thanks, Adam. I'm Kevin McGee, the environmental planner for the town of Guilford. Can everybody hear me okay before I continue? Okay. I'm here to talk about pretty much the tools in the toolbox for this plan here. The first being shoreline protection, which comes in about 4 different levels here. One looking at buffers for flood protection, natural resource protection, living shoreline protection, and hard shoreline protection. Buffers for flood protection. Buffers provide space for flood mitigation, wave attenuation between tidal waters and structures and infrastructures. The buffers may not stop waters from reaching the structures. However, research from coastal storm damage in the U.S. has shown storm damages are slowed and waves are attenuated when buffers are available. The use of buffers also help properties which may be subject to daily inundations in the future by sea level rise. As the space is left available, rather than being developed, the effects of daily inundation on developed property can be potentially delayed. Natural resource protection. As you know, Guilford has a great diversity and abundance of natural resources, which include our beaches, our dunes, our salt marshes and headwaters, forested headwaters. that buffer the coastline and serve as our natural defense against hazards such as storm surge, inland flooding, and sea level rise. And in order to maintain these, we place in the toolbox a couple suggestions or thoughts. One being routine and ongoing management activities of these resources, such as restoration activities of the salt marshes, one which we're looking at at the Leeds Island Marsh with the restoration of the tide gate down there, and the construction of pile-supported walkways to help with foot traffic instead of exacerbation of the erosion by people walking in the marshes along their shorelines. Two is forward-looking planning to accommodate the changes in habitat due to climate change. An example of this is the upland migration of salt marshes due to sea level rise. Our partners here with Nature Conservancy completed a study in 2013, and the results from this study shows that salt marsh advancement in Guilford, by the 28 projections that they came up with, indicate that will be basically pushing into 752 acres of upland that the salt marsh may be moving into. And currently, the town has 225 acres of this protected, with the remaining 526 acres publicly or privately owned on unprotected status. And another important thing is enforcement, modification, or development of new policies, which could be increasing current setbacks of buildings to accommodate the advancement of the sea level rise, protect health, safety, and infrastructures. Living shorelines, another protection method for our shorelines. Living shorelines are a management approach that uses the natural elements to protect our shorelines, such as vegetation and other vegetation, sand-filled barriers which are placed along the area. There's basically two types of these. One is the non-structural, which I indicated, which is great for low energy areas in terms of waves, or a hybrid technique, which incorporates the non-structural elements with the more traditional approaches we know with some stone and hardening. And generally here, with the Guilford having high wave energy with the way our currents are, the hybrid method would be some of the recommendations we're coming up with. The use of the living shoreline has actually been approved method now by DEP with recent acts happening about a year ago. DEP actually has started is actually looking for innovative low-impact approaches to the shoreline protection to handle sea level rise, including living shorelines, utilizing a variety of structural and organic materials, including tidal wetlands, plants, submerged aquatic vegetation, core fiber logs, sand fill, and stone to provide shoreline protection along the shorelines. And they were actually very interested in a grant that we went for last year and unable to achieve utilizing these type of approaches. In Guilford here, approaches that we can look at for living shorelines is using the dredge materials from our harbors to help stabilize the grass island, Chittenden Beach, and Chaffinch Island areas of town, which are suffering from erosion. Hard shoreline protection. This is the one I think the public likes best, but is least favorable by federal and state regulatory agencies. And as we know, these things pretty much fall into the seawalls, our jetties, our groins, bulkheads, and riprap, which provide protection from erosion and dissipate the wave energy. In the plan, and also referenced in previous plans, such as the town has a mitigation plan, that has recommended some hard shoreline instructional measures, such as extending the breakwater at Jacobs Beach, a construction of a new groin at Grass Island, installation of wave attenuations off our shoreline, and the construction of a groin off Chaffinch Island and on the east side of the West River in the area of Chittenden Park. Another topic of concern, which is shown here, and actually in the slides there, I'll go back to that one there, is, I didn't realize I had it behind me, is up in the upper left-hand corner is a sort of a slide of a living shoreline. It's not Guilford, but it's a slide Millennium Broom had. Below it is the hard shoreline protection that we see protecting our roadways. This is a shot on Falcon Road, which is an area Joe talked about, of another area of concern we need to look at. And now looking at our roads and transportation, as you see, Old Quarry Road, a couple years ago during a high tide event, these residents couldn't get in and out of their roadway. Over the summer, below is a picture of the completed road elevated. This is also at a high tide event, and you can see that this road is flooded and the residents can get in and out and not worry about looking at a tight schedule for when they're going in and out of their houses there. So as you can see, looking at Old Quarry Road here, and we know there's other roads in town which currently flood out, such as Shell Beach, Charlie Road, Tuttle's Point, River Street, sections of Soundview Road, and our state roads. It's important to note, 146 has several areas which floods out by Old Quarry, by the Lost Lake, Satcham's Head Road area, Jones's Bridge area, and we also have during high storms, can't forget about Boston Post Road at our west and east river bridges there. The state roads are a little bit more complicated, and it's going to require the town working with our neighbors in Branford, our Scenic Roads Group, the state regulators and state DOT to get these state roads elevated. The town, as Joe indicated, has a plan. It's a matter of getting the state to have a plan and help us out with the state roads here. Some other solutions here, or as one is demonstrated here, is the elevation of the roads. And there are some pros and cons to elevating the roads, such as the road can actually act as a dam and prevent the water or create increased backup to neighboring household properties which are kept at lower elevations. One thing that we are lucky about is that a lot of our main access ways which go through the marshes don't have the houses, so we can actually elevate without worrying about affecting neighboring properties there. As Joe indicated, we are looking at upcoming projects such as the Chapman Island Road and Tuttle's Point. As part of these projects, we don't get away with things from federal regulatory agencies. There's always mitigation projects that go along with, because elevating roads, we end up with filling marshland, and the state and Army Corps and other federal departments like seeing that land recreated back into wetlands, if not at that area of another piece of property in town. So we're working with the state with refurbishing Old Quarry, actually Leeds Marsh, which is heading down towards Old Quarry there. It's a 40-acre marsh which it's dealing with marsh subsidence. And it's flooded out, and hopefully by improvements to that marsh, we may be able to help 146 adjacent to that area there. Other methods in our toolbox with our roadways is evaluating our roads. Do we need the road there? Can it be abandoned? Can another road be built in a higher ground in the same area there? Do we have paper roads which basically could be turned into main roads to solve some of these issues here? Also looking at roads that we know certain roads flood, such as Water Street at Jones's Bridge all the time, and basically setting up emergency routes when we know it floods, as there are pretty much our detours for the areas, such as 3 Mile Course when Jones's Bridge floods, or even when it floods on by Lost Lake there, of having Moose Hill Road as a alternative egress way. Other types of access, unfortunately, if roads aren't being able to put back in, maybe we have to look at other ways such as boardwalks or boat access to different areas which may become up in the islands. Those are sort of last resorts there. The other next thing we look at is properties may come into serious problems, and this is in our toolbox here, with sanitary systems and water supply. As you can see in the picture up top here, wastewater will become an issue, and we're also going to talk about new construction, what you can do about it, and existing retrofits. New construction sanitary systems should be constructed as far away from the tidal waters as possible, and looking at potentially at least minimum 50 feet away from the high tide line. To allow this, septic systems should be constructed at a level that considers sea level rise. And the design of a septic plan should look at future locations for a retrofit system, a mound or holding tank, for future needs if the water comes higher than we need to, looking at the 2050 inundation depths. On-site retrofits, and I think this is where a lot of residents near the shoreline will fall into, the septic systems in the future can be elevated in a mound fill, which is shown in the upper right corner there next to that cottage there. In elevating the system, you may need some sort of engineered system, erosion control methods to help hold the soil in place during a storm, which may be some sort of geotechnical matting material. If elevation is not a suitable solution for the property, there are other options out there as last resorts, such as incineration toilets, composting toilets, heat-assisted composting toilets, or even a holding tank. The problems with these is your limited amount of water that you can utilize on the property. And holding tanks, as many people know, some people do have on the shoreline, and it does get expensive with regular pump outs of these systems here. Off-site retrofits can be done. One such thing is looking at neighboring property and doing leaching fields on adjacent property, which will require a pump system on your existing property here. Both of this would require approval by both property owners, an easement in the land records, and approval by the Director of Health and Commissioner of Public Health for the state of Connecticut. The development of community system, septic system, is an option there and was being studied in the Whitfield Street area town here, and basically looking at a system which is large enough to accommodate the neighborhood and is also not subject to the sea level rise. And they're also very strictly regulated with the state of Connecticut. Sanitary systems, actually sanitary sewer systems, which really isn't an option in the town of Guilford since we currently don't have any, would be noted in the plan as a very expensive option. Water supply, there's an option of individual water treatment systems for houses, which can remove the dissolved solids such as just salts and other minerals which are in the brackish waters being intruded into the waters. Development of a community well system, but this requires a very large property to site the well onto, and it requires approvals from the State Department of Health also. Extension of a water system, and this is actually something that's being looked at in a couple of our communities in town, such as the Mulberry Point and Tuttle's Point area town. The town has commissioned a feasibility study on this, and the health department's assisting these neighborhoods with this at this time. And the town recognizes that the long-term approach and the most viable means would be getting reliable water to these coastal neighborhoods. And the town should be continuing looking for grants to pay for these extensions. And last resort, if basically a property comes inhabitable due to health code standards, which are extreme conditions where you can't have potable water or a town-wide or basically a sanitary system, would be the vacated of the basically the house being vacated and abandoned. The problem with this is the tax does, as Joe indicated, the town will lose a tax base on this property. The property could be utilized for other public needs if this happens, and there are usually after major storms are grants available to help reimburse the property owners for the land. Regulatory controls, such as building codes, there are some pretty good strong building codes out there right now, which can be expanded on, and the plan does discuss some of these. One big one that's been discussed in the CAM plan before and now being discussed in this one here is freeboard standards. Basically, FEMA says your house can be built at a certain elevation. Freeboard is basically saying we as a town potentially want your house being a foot or two above that standard because we know water elevation will be increasing in the future, and we want you protected in the future from that, not with the current flood elevation or where the flood waters are now, but we want to look 50 years from now so you're not have to raise your house in the future. Another one which kind of goes similar with that is applying V standards in the A zone, which is protecting your houses from waves. And then looking at zoning amendments and other regulatory procedures, looking at flexible development processes, building height standards, because people are finding out as we're elevating these houses, they're going back to ZBA because they then exceed their height requirements. So building height standards is something that's going to need to be looked at. Land conservation standards for marsh advancement, looking at basically setback changes to allow marsh advancement or conservation easements or something to allow for advancement of our wetlands to help protect with our coastal environments here. And possibly zoning map overlays. The last topic I have is acquisition of properties, which I'll quickly go over. An acquisition of flood-prone properties in areas susceptible to sea level rise has been considered in order to provide public safety, marsh migration, and in some cases, public access to the shoreline. Property acquisition will generally fall into basically 4 categories the plan indicated. The first includes open space and undeveloped land. This is, as indicated, to allow for marsh advancement, protection of our coastal forested areas. The second is looking at existing developed property may be acquired pursuant to the plan, and such areas would be the already damaged or vulnerable properties and houses due to storms or future storms due to sea level rise. And then a third situation would be situations where on-site solutions are not feasible for providing the portable water supply or sanitary systems for a property where they basically become uninhabitable due to health code standards. Fourth is not looking at basically acquisition of shoreline properties, but the town also, due to this, as Joe talked about, for increase our taxes, we also need to look at, we have some recreational areas on our shoreline which could be flooded out due to this, such as our Chittenden Park playing fields and some of the fields at Calvin School. So we may need to look at inland properties to make up for these losses of playing fields. Funding for these acquisitions are, as we know, town bonds are always potential opportunities. State grants, we're always looking for grants to help buy land. And federal fundings, which a lot of times come up after these major storms. FEMA had some funding after Irene and Sandy, and also the Department of Agriculture also had funding. I remember coming out for looking at properties along the shoreline in near hazard areas. So after storms, we as a town need to be cognizant and having staff also trained in these potential funding opportunities so we can also help inform our public of these opportunities. Thanks for your time, and next is Alex from Yale.
All right. Okay, so let's see. As you can see, we've spent quite a bit of time thinking about these issues and trying to come up with an understanding of what Guilford's specific challenges are and the options that we face. And you can see that there are a lot of options. One of the questions is kind of how do you make decisions within that context, and how do you prioritize your decisions through a typical town process. So you can see right now we're in the second box, the Plan of Conservation Development Approval. Within that, we're asking for the approval or the evaluation of this document in relation to the POCD. And that would then modify the hazard mitigation, the role of the hazard mitigation plan. You choose an institution to play a role as the manager, overseer of this process, and go through a series of tasks that would lead to approvals on specific proposed projects. So as George mentioned earlier, we're not asking for the voting of this does not put in place any kind of specific changes. It puts in place a process. So we're going to start to describe a little bit of that process. Next slide. It's a public process, and the idea, is that we're all living here in this town, and we all have the interest of the town as part of our goals is to maintain the value of our properties, of the town itself, of the infrastructure, housing, and also to manage risk. And so, because of the complexity of the issues and the fact that we've urbanized in these coastal areas and the kind of challenges we face are multi-scale as well as individual homeowner to multiple groups. The idea is to really create a process that's tailored to specific communities and that seeks participation from multiple participants towards the implementation of these projects, and also that's really geared towards a kind of collective learning because we're sharing our concerns and our issues. And as was mentioned earlier by the first selectman, the state of Connecticut is learning as different towns are pushing these agendas forward and figuring out ways to manage information, share information, develop decisions collectively. And so this is a kind of a learning process not only for Guilford, but more broadly. So next slide. So Adam from TNC already touched on this, the value of positioning Guilford to get funding from various federal, state, and local sources, such as the NOAA grant, which fed this process that brought us all together. And keep in mind, this is an unusual group. I'm from Yale. On the academic side, I'm actually a landscape architect and ecologist and work to combine those interests. So there's a kind of practical angle of my interest. But you've got Nature Conservancy working across the state, across the coast, and has a much broader, holistic understanding of what is coming down the pipeline, what funding opportunities are, and they're linking that to the community. And then we were working closely with Malone and McBroom, who's also here in the audience, with the technical skills and background and the knowledge from having worked with towns across Connecticut coast for decades. Plus, we were working in close collaboration with Kevin, George, and others. So, this was a process that was made, that was funded and supported by this outside funding source. And there are other examples of that. Kevin mentioned the Long Island Sound Futures Fund grant that we applied for Living Shoreline. We're actively seeking funding because Guilford has positioned itself and set itself apart from a lot of other towns across the coast that to take a proactive stance and figure out solutions. And then if you look at the community rating system, that's part of the value of this process also is in positioning Guilford to apply for and fit into the community rating requirements that you see there on the right. Next slide. So what are the next steps? Defining and tailoring to local communities and neighborhoods, what I'm calling zones of shared risk, which I'll explain in a second. And then being in communication, accessing information, and getting involved. The idea here is really to get your feedback, not only today, but hopefully as we move forward, to have a commitment and kind of participatory role in this land planning project. Go ahead. So when you think about Guilford, and as you can see, the red circles are all the culverts along waterways, and so you can see there's a series of channel restrictions. It's the Metro North line and the earth berm that was developed there, along with Route 146. It's kind of working sometimes in collaboration, sometimes against each other, catching water that's flowing down, and then tidal marsh water that's coming up. So Long Marsh is a great example of this, where you have these existing conditions, and we've built out in neighborhoods along this, and we're trying to figure out what are the best solutions given what we have built and the infrastructure we have in place, and taking into consideration that Guilford is not just a coastal community, it's a whole community that includes inland areas with people that don't face some of these issues. And so there's a whole question of how do we prioritize the challenges along the coast with the broader concerns of the town of Guilford. And I think that idea of prioritization is something that needs further evaluation and feedback in order to highlight and determine steps forward. So next slide. As you can see in green, these are what we're calling zones of shared risk. So what we found in working with communities, and one of my areas or core focus is working with communities in long-term planning or town planning, around public parks, around large-scale green infrastructure, and coastal adaptation. And so in this case, different people have different issues, and you can actually identify groups of populations that we're calling zones of shared risk that share similar issues that can come together and start trying to figure out how to solve those issues. So for example, look at Long Marsh and the Sachem's Head egress here where you get the flooding underneath the culvert. that impacts, the 100-odd homeowners in the St. Joe Ted, but in these neighborhoods here, they're trying to access their property. And over time, if you have this egress issue that may not be an everyday issue, but it's a periodic problem, that could potentially reduce your future home buyer population, for example. It may create a perception of risk that might reduce the perceived value of properties. You may end up having people move out because of their concerns. So those kinds of sort of bulk challenges that larger populations face are the kinds of prioritization strategies that we'd like to investigate and work through with you, with neighborhoods, through this process of engagement that we're describing. Let's see, next slide. And back one, there's the repetitive flood loss homes that are all in red here are another set of issues that's more of a specific subpopulation that it faces. So you can see how you start to understand these zones of shared risk could be a group of 6 to 10 houses that are on the coast that face particular concerns. Next slide. Mulberry Point in the Cove is an interesting example. There was, the debate. You've got the Mulberry Point, which floods periodically, so you've got this egress issue here. And then you've got topographic changes in the neighborhood where you have half the road faces septic challenges and the other half doesn't. So you've got this discrepancy on an individual road, and you've got egress challenges in the longer term. So these are really site-specific challenges that require feedback and input from homeowners to think more targeted, more specifically, and think in a targeted way about maintaining property ownership and individual property value, and thinking about the homeowner as a decision maker and how that works within the context of infrastructure funding from the town and the larger set of maintenance operations and other costs that the town faces, and how to balance these kinds of local and town-wide issues. Next slide, and we're wrapping up shortly. This is so the neighborhood scale kind of zone of shared risk. Just taking a look at Seaside Avenue here, and Jacobs Beach. So this was Sandy 2012 when it flooded. I don't know if everybody remembers, about maybe 4 feet of water. And then this is a map using the TNC's Coastal Resilience Plan. So Adam mentioned this. It's online. It's accessible for anybody to access. It was worked on through NOAA and NASA Goddard Institute. It's a kind of state-of-the-art in terms of the application, but also it lets you do low hurricane, higher hurricane. It lets you play with the information. So you can see some of the implications. This is an SLR condition, and then this is a Category 3 storm surge event. You can see how similar actually the Sandy was to SLR 2080. Sandy sort of was a kind of dry run of what it's going to look like in 2080s, with sea level rise. Sandy's kind of a dry run of thinking about what every day, twice a day is going to look like in 2080. Next slide. So we took that information and just took it. This is an example, and this was not. This did not go through the same process that we're describing today. It's a kind of illustration of the kind of process and analysis that we might go through. And we did this example to kind of conceptualize or take the information that Kevin went through, that kind of exhaustive list of different potential practices, and to see how those can come together and be illustrated in a plan that anybody can take a look at and understand. And so you're going from the current conditions here in the black are the existing homes, to a 2080 condition where you've got substantial, flooding, and this road really becomes kind of inaccessible. So what do you do? How do you transition? So the idea is we want to increase economic development. We want to add, value to the land. And so essentially, we're looking at the top. It goes from A actually to B here. All right, yeah. So you see the yellow up there. That's the Town Center South plan. The idea is you've got the Amtrak station. There's some properties that you could potentially acquire and use those as an economic redevelopment for a transit-oriented development. So you get homes near the Amtrak station. And essentially, you actually couple that effort of transit-oriented development with a coastal adaptation solution where these houses are in gray. It's a little hard to see. But you create kind of new edge with a home that's more of a urban kind of bungalow style, or something that is where the landscape underneath is actually managed and maintained as a living shoreline. So you orchestrate a new seam or a new edge that can be managed by the town, but that has economic value because of the property, and it's linked to the transit. And then over time, you would acquire properties. You can see in green up here. And actually, a Connecticut Mirror article by Jan Spiegel wrote about this plan proposal, and she interviewed several of the homeowners, some of whom had already sold. And if nothing else, it illustrated the challenges and the perspective of the homeowner and the kind of the complex concerns they have over their property and the repetitive flood loss, and kind of what the long-term viabilities were. About 4 of those properties sold to a developer recently who believed it was amazing, those properties, but ultimately those were sort of flexible, had the potential of becoming more of a management tool for the town. And the idea is you actually increase or you proactively develop more recreation in these zones that are transition zones. So you can develop cut-fill landscapes, which is what we were proposing on those properties there. To develop cut-fill raised areas for communal septic to prolong some of the homes along the roadway. And the lower areas would become living shorelines. So you combine a strategy of septic with living shoreline function. And over time, you pull the beach back, so you can maybe potentially enlarge the beach and have it more with the town, enhance recreation, develop cut-fill landscapes along Chapman's Park area that would become potentially bird-watching locations or a boardwalk, and so you can kind of enhance recreational strategies in this coastal area while also increasing some of the development along the edge. And over time, the properties along the coast could be high-end properties and maintained as they are, or depending on the circumstances, they could also become part of this larger recreational town focus, or part of the town's kind of recreational development in this area. And so the notion would be that this would be like a destination point and so, for recreation, for the beach, et cetera, but also that you would redevelop in certain areas along the seam and protect the back portions of the town. Next slide. I'm going to now pass it on to George to wrap up the presentation, and thanks for your time.
Thanks to all of our experts tonight. We are concluding our presentation now. We do want to invite you to come forward and ask questions and tell us what you think of all this. I know we've covered a lot of ground. It's been very complicated. Hopefully you are familiar with or had an opportunity to familiarize yourself with some of the things that we've been talking about. In an effort to kind of manage your input and help us coherently collect and record what people are saying, what they're asking, we're going to invite you to come up to the podium and ask your question and make your comments. That way we can keep a record of what people say. And I'm going to also invite Nathan Froling, who's with the Nature Conservancy, to be the moderator of this question and answer and comment period. So Nathan, if you'll join me up here. And I know we have some people who would like to talk to us and ask questions, so please come forward and come up to the microphone. Yes.
Good to see you, John.
Good evening.
So I will step out of the way.
I'd like to make some brief comments. I'm currently the chairman of the Hazard Mitigation Commission for the town. Previously, I've chaired the Harbor Management Commission. I chaired the group that rewrote the Harbor Management Plan, rewrote the Coastal Area Management Plan, and wrote the current Hazard Mitigation Plan. Most of those plans, if they did exist, were 15 to 20 years old, so it's good to have something that's up to date at this point to work with. And the current plan that's proposed builds on those 3 tools, updated tools, which I call a three-legged stool, that gives us a solid framework, to-date framework, to deal with. I'd like to tell you about the Dutch philosophy about living with water. Their philosophy is you have to make room for the water. You don't have to abandon land. You don't have to leave. You don't have to leave in panic. But you do have to plan for water that's going to happen. Happen how? Now's not a time for panic or a knee-jerk reaction, but it's true, and you can see every day that we're realizing climate change. More violent storms, more frequent storms. That should be our immediate concern. How to deal with those current aberrations, which have occurred in the past, but are occurring more frequently now, and threaten valuable property along the shoreline. That's important to deal with now. Why? It's not a time for panic, but it is a time for action, because those solutions will take a long time to get the funding and implement, a decade or more. But secondary to that, not secondary importance, but secondary in a time frame, is that we are facing what is quite apparent to be sea level rise. We may not realize, even in some of our lifetimes, including mine, what that really means in its full disastrous effect, if it occurs. But we should be planning for it, because that will also take several decades and a lot of money to deal with. So my plea tonight is, think of the Dutch philosophy. What can we do to make room for the water? And secondly, think in terms of two stages. First, let's deal with the immediate problem, which is climate change and violent storms that we can deal with. And secondly, the long-term concern that we may have to deal with significant sea level rise over several decades. And now is the time to plan for that, because we're talking about a lot of time and a lot of money to deal with it. Thank you.
I'm going to actually make a couple comments quickly myself, although you're welcome to come up. As an observer listening to what was presented to you, I can only imagine how overwhelming it may seem or look, and how hard it may have been to follow any of one particular detail. A couple things strike me as important to point out. One, in the years that we've been doing this, we've been looking at maps of projected sea level rise, or maps that show where storm events will go in terms of the elevation of the water. And it's pretty dramatic, it's pretty frightening. The good news is that we have still a lot of time before some of those more dramatic water levels occur. And as John just said, it's that time that we have to begin anticipating that and being prepared for that. But I just want to acknowledge how what we're presenting tonight and what we're talking about is really significant in the potential change within this century. Also, we threw a lot of technical tools at you, and don't expect you to necessarily follow all that. Hopefully the plan, if you look at it, is much clearer, and there's more and more detail the further you go down and look. But I think another important point to make is that while this is a town plan and this is enabling the town government to be aware and prepared, it is as much or more a vehicle for all of us. The neighborhoods, I live in Tuttle's Point, I'm part of one of those coastal communities. For all of us as town citizens as well as the government to think together about this issue, and this plan is really meant to be a facilitator for getting ready to move into the future. So I just wanted to highlight those points, and I may think of other things I can't help but say as well as we go. But I'll stop talking, and please do come up to the microphone. Thank you.
Hi, I live on Vineyard Point, and I think this is a very impressive, oh yes, I'm Joanne Bickle, I live on Vineyard Point. I think this is a very impressive effort. I have a couple of suggestions I'd like to make. First of all, Vineyard Point always seems to fall through the cracks on these plans, but I'm sure it's there on the map, and you know that there's, I'm talking to all of you, and you know that there's a causeway that goes to Vineyard Point, which on the care of roads and the really should be in the list. So I do hope it's there. Vineyard Point is a community of people from 2 years old to 94, and they're all year-round residents. And I think it's of great concern that the sea level is certainly rising there, and we have a point where there is flooding right now. There is the suggestion that you have a permanent standing committee for the administration of this plan. And I would like to suggest that you really get representatives from every one of these neighborhoods. Sachem's Head, Vineyard Point, Tuttle's Point, so forth. It might make it large, it might make it a bit unwieldy, but I think you need all those representatives there in order to deal with the prioritization that's going to be necessary. That is about all I have to say, but don't forget about Vineyard Point.
Comments or questions? Oh, people are lining up. Go ahead.
My name is Van Billings. My wife and I live at 65 Seaside Avenue. We have a retirement home there. We don't live there all the time. I live also up in the Adirondacks. But we're at the low point on Seaside Avenue. And it might be worth noting whoever built our house had a little wisdom and built it up a little bit higher, and we've never had water come into the house based on the tidal flooding. I do get a little water in the basement when the sump pump stops, when the electric stops, but not from the flooding, okay, even though we're at the low point. We are at the point that doesn't exist on one of the maps there, where they say we won't be there anymore. I have a bachelor's degree from Cornell in marine biology, Department of Conservation. I understand the need to protect the environment. I'm very concerned about conservation, marshes, wildlife. I've served on my upstate New York planning board for 5 years and was the chairman of it. And I understand long-term planning and needs for that stuff. So I appreciate all the work that's going on here in the Coastal Resilience Plan. However, it would seem to me that the basis of the report are some computer-generated projections that don't seem to have a lot of real-time data involved in it. They show some wildly variable projections depending upon which computer modeling you use. If you look in the back of the report, you'll see pretty substantial differences between one. They took out some of the graphs that were in the original reports that had sweeping things and confidence levels on them, and they pulled that stuff out of the report in this most recent version, but they were there, and they're wildly variable because these models are wildly variable. So I went out looking for the most recent data from NOAA. You can go onto the NOAA site since we're funded by NOAA, and you can pull up the sea level trends. It's pretty simple on their site there. And we happen to have 2 spots that measure sea level actively that kind of bracket us. We have a gauge in Bridgeport and a gauge in New London. And when you look at the 2 gauges and what they project there for sea level, both current and historically, it turns out that the mean sea level trend is rising at 2.56 millimeters per year with a 95% confidence level. That means the data really supports that information. That goes from 1938 to 2013 at New London, which is equivalent to 0.84 feet in rise per 100 years. Now, I know those graphs show us going up 15, 16, 20, 30 feet, whatever it is. But the actual data so far doesn't seem to support that. I know we're talking about global warming, then when they had no trouble with the temperature sort of stabilizing, they changed it to global change. But so that's one of the things. If you look at the Bridgeport one, we're looking at a 0.94 feet change every 100 years. And that's data up to 2013. So it includes the recent data that's there. And you can just pull this up on the NOAA site anytime you want to. So I was a little disturbed by that because I submit that the most current data that NOAA shows measures sea rise level at those 2 stations, and the actual data as opposed to computer modeling, which has projected much larger increases than are actually occurring. Additionally, the report repetitively talks about increased frequency and intensity of storms. But the real data shows that hurricanes strike the United States on the last 100 years on an average of 7 hurricanes hitting the continental United States every year. In the last 50 years, there have not been more than 7 strikes per year. And actually what that does is bring the last 50 years down to less than 7 hits, major storms hits per year in the United States, which means the frequency of major storms has actually decreased in the last 50 years over the last 100 years. So I think that maybe we're kind of projecting, because we see stuff on TV a lot and we talk about it, about everything that's getting worse, when in reality the data does not necessarily support that. The entire basis of the Coastal Resilient Report doesn't seem to be based in measured actual data. And I know we had 2 bad storms. I mean, we lived through them with our house there. So there's no question about it. But that's just the averages catching up, because we didn't have bad storms hit us for a long time. I grew up, there were bad hurricanes. I mean, I wasn't old enough to be around for the 1930-something hurricane, but that was even worse than these last ones. So, at least for Connecticut, it was worse. By accepting this report and then basing public policy on it, it will have a dramatic impact on the lives and the finances of the people in Guilford. It requires people in the shoreline communities with possible tidal flooding to adhere. Probably they'll change the zoning to make us adhere to V, that's velocity of waves. Construction on the houses, it's going to cost us more when we do remodeling, when we do other things. When that's projected for 50, 80 years in the future on those numbers. When building and remodeling, we had a huge cost. The idea of raising some roads, great idea. Ought to be thinking about it. The minute you see the water across the road, we should have been thinking about it. We probably didn't need this report to understand that we needed to do something about the roads. Maybe the report is there because it enhances the funding, and I can understand that, but would it be part of the process anyway? Most disturbing to me is the concept that it may not be worth spending money to protect the properties of Seaside Avenue where I live. If you haven't read the report, you should read the section on Seaside Avenue, because it's pretty obvious that basically that's a throwaway neighborhood now. The goal seems to be to let the area go back to marsh, to create an island at the end of the road, to abandon the road, to set up a procedure that circumvents normal eminent domain laws, and allow the taking of properties such that the town can determine when and for how much they intend to take the properties on the road. And you just read what it says. It's not like, and nobody here, when they're mentioning all the neighborhoods, they don't mention building up the roads on Seaside Avenue. It's just not one of the options. They're not planning on doing that. Doesn't seem like, seems to me like we're being just cut out of the process. And I know that we could be offered that they could buy our house and we could move from there to a condo over by the railroad station, but to be honest, I probably would not have moved to Guilford to live in a condo by the railroad station. Would not have been my goal in life to retire that way. Just the acceptance of part of the report and making a public declaration of this will do irreparable damage to the existing values and marketability of the properties on Seaside Avenue. And I would say, by the way, that's not just Seaside Avenue, it's a lot of the areas. When accepted public policy is based on the Coastal Resilience Plan, then the first steps will have been taken to abandon Seaside Avenue. Jacobs Beach is going to change, maybe go, the marina, the Guilford Yacht Club, and all the fine shoreline features that have provided all the Guilford residents access to beauty and recreation along Island Sound. You know, if you know that you're not going to have the beach in the future, why are you going to maintain it? Why'd we just spend $1 million on the beach there to maintain it and fix it up if it's going to disappear in 10 years, 5 years? If you take the projection of just a foot or two of water, that beach gets destroyed every time there's a storm, right? So why spend the money there? Doesn't make sense. So you might as well face it right now and stop doing it. If the long-term goal is abandonment, the town cannot justify the improvements, repairs, or maintenance of those facilities. I'm also a licensed real estate broker in the state of New York and in the state of Connecticut. And it seems to me that just publishing this report, accepting this report, dramatically alters the value of the properties that are considered in this report. because you're telling the world that those properties are maybe not going to exist in the future. So the day after you vote, or the planning board accepts it, or the first selectman accept that, you now have a different financial status for those properties. It'll take time for that data to show up. It doesn't show up overnight, but the sales will be more difficult. The property values will decrease, because personally, I'm not sure I'd want to buy a house on a street that the town probably was projecting wouldn't exist. Would you? I don't know. So think about that and what it will do to the whole tax base of the whole town and the whole nature, just in accepting public policy that creates all those changes. I don't know where to go with that, but that's my input and that's my feelings, and I think that's what I'm supposed to do. So I'm submitting my letter here to the town.
Thank you for that input. That's significant. Couple of responses, just for clarification. I want to underscore how important it is that the Seaside Avenue neighborhood, which is modeled, was done as an example. If you look at these projections, and they are computer models, that's the best science as far as we know in the world, and we can talk a lot more about that. But if you accept the projections as best estimates of what could happen, recognizing that there is a range of possibilities, no one knows exactly what's going to happen, could be a lot worse, frankly, than what's projected. Seaside Avenue is one of the most vulnerable communities in Guilford. So the plan is taking Seaside Avenue and saying, okay, if these projections are potentially going to take place, what are some examples of how we might approach that? And it's important to point out, and again, we kind of had to rush through it, but it is not that tomorrow or even in the next 10 or 20 years we suddenly abandon Seaside Avenue at all, but rather we begin to take steps that enable that community to stay what it is as long as it can, but also to begin to prepare for a changing future. Every step of the way, the town and the residents in all these neighborhoods will be deciding what is in your best interest. Nobody's going to come and say that community no longer matters, or that is not at all what this plan is about. So I really want to emphasize that the plan wouldn't be doing its job if it wasn't looking at those numbers, those very real numbers, and looking at what they may mean and thinking about how a better future could come about as a result of having done that thinking in advance. And Adam, I don't know if you want to comment at all on the science at all, but you'll leave it as it is. But we'll just, if anyone has questions about those projections, the science behind it, we're more than happy to provide all the information in the world that you might want or need.
Joe Nugent, south of the tracks. First, a disclaimer. I'm speaking as an individual, not a representative of any neighborhood association, nor of any town committee or town commission, or any other private committee that I serve on. The way I look at this, oh, by the way, I live in Guilford, and I'm here to watch the tide come in and go out every 6 hours and 22 minutes. I don't live in upstate New York, so I watch the tidal change. And I've lived there for 41 years, and I've seen the changes in the area. The way I look at this is like the lobster sitting in a pot of water on top of a stove, and then someone turns on the heat. And it's just a matter of time before you're going to start to hear things are going to start to change. This commission has a responsibility to all the citizens of Guilford. They should accept the plan.
Sid Gale, 250 Flag Marsh Road. I want to apologize at the beginning if my voice fails me or I start hacking. I'm dealing with a little touch of pneumonia, but the good part of that is that having my lungs underwater kind of puts me in the mood of this evening's subject. I have a number of questions and even more comments. In fact, could I trouble you to bring up the slide for Seaside Avenue at stage 3? I'd like to get to that at some point. I'd like to begin by introducing myself in order to explain my perspective in which I approach the report. 10 years ago tomorrow, the town of Guilford sponsored a workshop on climate change for Connecticut municipal officials. I chaired that workshop, co-convening it with George Krawl and Leslie Kane, the environmental planner at that time. Prior to that, I've been involved in the town in the Economic Development Commission, the Planning and Zoning Commission, chaired the Transportation Plan, and in a moment of weakness agreed to be the first chair of the Town Center South Plan. I came to Town Center South Plan really from the transportation experience and with the intent of creating a transit-oriented development in this area. But it occurred to me, well, one of the first things that we needed to do, given this town's sensitivity to environmental issues, is to understand where those sensitivities are, particularly with climate change becoming an increasingly evolving issue. Where we could build, where we shouldn't build, and how we should build. So essentially, I mentioned this to establish that we've been at this for 10 years now. And I think my first statement is to say some disappointment that we are not farther along the trajectory of our planning than we are at this point in time. It's true that we were the first town in Connecticut to address this issue, as far as some researchers tell me, but we have not progressed sufficiently with our initial initiative. And I think that bears some reflection going forward from this point. We do not have the luxury of time. If you look at the various issues that have been raised in this report, the complexity of them, and need I say the difficulty in funding the solutions for them, we do not have the luxury of time. One of the things that disturbs me most about this report is that it lacks any quantification of the economic exposure that's presented in this report. On a half a dozen occasions, and specifically informally on November 18th of last year, I requested a year ago to the Board of Selectmen and previously to members of the Planning Committee that they compile statistics of the number of properties, the acreage of those properties, the value of those properties that would go underwater as projected in this plan. And also the number of properties, the acreage of the properties, and the value of properties that would not necessarily be underwater by 2080 as projected in this plan, but would be affected by the status of our roadways that give access to them, and in that access give value. There has been a studied concerted ignorance or resistance to provide that very basic information. And I don't know how you can call something a plan, particularly in the context of how we need to act, without having an understanding of the economic context that we're trying to manage. So as far as I'm concerned, right out of the chute, I don't think that the Planning and Zoning Commission or the Board of Selectmen can, with any sense of responsibility and due diligence, approve this plan as it is until it makes up for that deficit of information. I can think of no other body of information that will crystallize the thinking of this entire town as when they understand what the potential is. Now, to cite the potential is not to say that we're going to lose all that money in tax base. It's to say this is the definition of the problem. How do we choose to approach it? Where do we get the resources to deal with it? What's worth saving and what's not worth saving? You can't do that in a piecemeal effort, neighborhood by neighborhood. You have to have a town concept, a town strategy for making contingency plans, for setting priorities. And that is not done in this plan at this time. And it lacks the information to do it. That's a fundamental flaw. A number of things about the plan kind of caught me strangely. For example, I know that it suggests that the lower end of Soundview Avenue may not be able to support its current industrial base, but it proposes that it might be good enough for residential development of about 15 houses. I find that kind of curious, okay? It's too dangerous for fuel tanks, but it's okay for people. Now, maybe somebody can explain the logic of that to me, but it gets to the question of, okay, what kind of priorities and thinking are envisioned in this planning process that's being presented to us? And in fairness to the plan, I have to say, I've seen that same kind of logic play out in other areas as well, where it seems we place property on a higher value than we do people's safety and well-being. I guess one thing that disturbs me from the experience of the past 10 years is to see a house constructed from a tear down and now on the market on Seaside Avenue with a listing price of $1.4 million. And this report says that by 2050, that house may have to be abandoned. Because while it has been elevated to FEMA standards, as they are today, which, by the way, do not take into the account the impacts of sea level rise going forward and the resultant increase in tidal surge with that increase of sea level rise. We have used the fig leaf of existing and inadequate code to permit the placement of greater investment in an area of known danger. And now the question becomes, having done that and having that on the market, what's a prospective buyer from out of town and out of state going to know about that piece of property when they consider the beauty of living on that lovely shoreline overlooking lovely Long Island Sound and not knowing that according to the projections in this plan, which I'm willing to accept, the very projections in this plan discount the value of that property by 60%. Because a new house like that should live for 100 years. And granted, nobody will plan to live in it for 100 years, but they will plan that when their time is done, they're going to take some equity out of that. And maybe if they're really lucky, they'll take some appreciation as well, because as we all know, they're not making any more shoreline property. But as we also know, they're making less of it. And that particular house now sits on less of it, or what will be less of it. And there are two more planned to follow it. So the question begins, or becomes, at what point do we stop this idiocy? Now, the cop-out of the Planning and Zoning Commission will be, well, we don't have the zoning or the regulations in place to prevent this kind of thing. They comply with code. It's a property owner's right. The property owner, of course, is the developer. He's not going to be left holding the bag in the end. It's going to be whoever buys that house and then discovers 5 years down the road that it wasn't the gem they thought it was, because it didn't come with a warning label. It didn't come with a warning label you get on prescription drugs. It didn't come with the guarantee that you get under the lemon law for buying a car. It didn't come with anything suggested in the commercial code of the U.S. on the implied warranty of merchantability, that when a person buys a new house like that, they're going to expect a certain life and a certain market value associated with that house. But we know that won't be the case. And we also seem disinclined to put that knowledge on the property record for the benefit of a prospective buyer. Now, that piece of knowledge doesn't only apply to that prospective buyer of a brand new FEMA high-rise, it applies to every other property on that road and every other road like it in town. Pardon me, as promised. There are two concerns that probably someone sitting in the first selectman's chair has. Number one is that if we implemented the appropriate notices in the land records to let people know the risk that they're possibly exposed to of condemnation of their property under certain possible contingencies, if we put that in the property records, the first selectman's probably concerned that the current owners will sue the town for an uncompensated taking. The bigger concern is if somebody buys that house not knowing the circumstances and then discovers after the fact what they really did buy, and then discovers furthermore that the town knew this was going to happen or projected it to be a possibility, I have a feeling that some enterprising attorney is going to find a way to run a successful suit in their behalf. And in fact, the first indication of that was seen in Chicago when an enterprising insurance company brought suit against the city of Chicago or some suburban community for failing to take proactive action to prevent the flooding that caused property damage to their insureds. Now, they ultimately dropped it, but that's the warning shot of what can come. I believe one of the earlier speakers expressed the concern that to put this report out would diminish property values. This report is not responsible for that. FEMA's responsible for that. FEMA's raised the insurance premiums for flood insurance, and I think there are a number of realtors who tell you that since that has occurred, properties in certain areas have not moved. That's a fait accompli. The increasing climate change is going to drop values as people become more aware of the impacts, as even banks who are still out to lunch and retail insurers who insure property still think of sea level rise as regular flooding. Sea level rise isn't regular flooding as we've come to know it. The flooding we're talking about is storm flooding. It comes, it goes, periodically, we clean up, we repair, we move on. Sea level rise comes twice a day at high tide. At some point in time, as in the case of Seaside Avenue, that neighborhood's going to be Tostados. That's a different scenario. People need to understand that. Both the people who own those properties today and the people who might consider buying them tomorrow in ignorance. They need to understand that. And any red-blooded free enterprise capitalist should recognize that the basis of a market economy is the basic basis of shared information between buyer and seller so that they can negotiate a valid price. Under that concept, as people understand climate change better and sea level rise better, the markets are going to affect that reality. Okay, that's not in our hands alone. What this report should be doing is to put that information out to the public so that whether you believe in climate change or not, you can make your own decision. But I don't see anything in this plan that calls for those kinds of changes in our regulatory procedure in town. And that ought to be one of the top priorities. One of the problems I have with this being part of the POCD is that the POCD is 10 years forward-looking. This plan ought to have a clear set of priorities of what we need to be doing today to lay the foundation for future actions that we know will be necessary and contingencies that may become necessary. It does not have that. It's a great reference document. It's a great policy compendium. It is not a plan of action leading to specific results. And wherever you are on the issue of climate change, for this document to be worth anything in the POCD, it needs to accomplish that result. Looking here, just brief, yep.
We're just looking at the time.
Okay. I urge you to make sure the economic information is made a part of this plan and not kick that can down the road any further. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience.
Tough act to follow. I wanted to say something about the two previous speakers, not Mr. Nugent, but the speaker prior to Mr. Nugent, talking about the neighborhood that was illustrated there, and then Sid's comments. I think, for me, call to make it very clear how difficult this process is and this project is. On the one hand, we have somebody saying, we've done way too much, we shouldn't be doing this at all. The phenomena that we're trying to plan for isn't real, and therefore we don't need to do anything to deal with what this plan sees as some major issues. And then on the other hand, we had Sid Gale talking about, my way of thinking, the opposite extreme. We haven't done nearly enough. The impacts of the sea level rise phenomena and the related phenomena are so significant that we need to be much more proactive in terms of what we should be doing, and we haven't done nearly enough in this plan, and therefore we should reject it. I think those two extreme views kind of illustrate the difficulty that we have, and in my honest opinion, I think the planning document that we've created by no means is a complete one, or is it adequate to all the challenges that we have, but it represents a very conservative approach. I think it's very important, since we've had so much conversation about Seaside Avenue, to keep in mind the point that several people have made, including the authors of the plan, that this is an illustration of how a neighborhood-based planning process might work. It illustrates, in my opinion, actually a very positive view of preservation and planning for the long-term future of that neighborhood, if the best science that we know of and the predictions that this science represents do come about. And it by no means is a rejection, or as someone mentioned to me privately about another neighborhood that is very vulnerable in Guilford, Neck Road, by no means is this a redlining of this particular neighborhood. I think the plan concepts, the illustrative plan concepts that you saw represented in Seaside are actually a very positive view of this neighborhood. They represent some really highly desirable characteristics from a development point of view, making this area a very special place in Guilford 100 years from now or 50 years from now. It's by no means an abandonment of this neighborhood. I don't think any of the authors of this plan are contemplating anything like an abandonment of that neighborhood or any other. On the other hand, the plan recognizes that this science shows us there's some significant things that are going to be occurring, and that we need to think about, and you, the people who live in these neighborhoods and own property in these neighborhoods, need to think about in order to preserve the best that we have in our shoreline. That's what this plan is all about. It really challenges us to do that. It's not a redlining of these neighborhoods or a suggestion, on the one hand, that there's going to be an onerous government takeover, which is kind of one scenario, nor is it an abandonment of these neighborhoods and say you're on your, telling the neighborhood that you're on your own. To me, it represents a positive approach, and it challenges us to plan for the future, which I'm with Mr. Finley about the neighborhood. Hopefully these projections won't occur. I mean, none of us want this to happen, and this plan does not make it happen. The plan recognizes that the best science suggests that it might happen over a long period of time, and we have an opportunity to plan for it. That's what this is really all about.
Come on up. Oh, I'm so sorry. I keep looking here. And
I snuck up on you. Name's Tom Scotchless, 33 Seaside Avenue. I don't yet have enough information for myself whether I would like to recommend the planning and zoning or the town board to reject or approve the plan. However, I would caution that they maybe require more information before making a decision on the plan. In the part of the plan, of course, that was made public to us, the public, It doesn't appear that any of the data or assertions made in the report are founded on any sort of science, because there's no reference to any science publications. It's funded in part by NOAA, yet doesn't reference or cite any NOAA publications. I'm an author in my field of work, and when I write a paper and present it at a conference, I have to cite references and things like this, and I don't see any of these references in the report. One of the conservative approaches for the sea level rise by 2020, I believe, if I remember correctly, said 6 or 9 inches by 2020. That's only 6 years away. The best way to predict the future is to look at the past. In the past 6 years, the sea level certainly didn't rise 6 or 9 inches. So I question the integrity of the very assertions made in the paper and suggest that the town maybe require more information before being ready to make any sort of decision on the matter. Thank you.
While the next speaker is coming up, and perhaps it's not totally clear in reading the what we've called Phase 3, it's called to your attention in response to the last speaker, the risks and vulnerabilities section of this report, the first document that was written, which extensively documents the science about with regard to the various projections. So this is not based on any willy-nilly guesses about the future. It is based on the best science, and those projections are illustrated in a great deal of detail. And you can look at them yourself, and you can play with them and manipulate them and enlarge them and look at specific properties if you want to actually use the Nature Conservancy tool. If anybody has any trouble doing that, we'd be happy to help you do that as well. But it is quite well documented what the science is behind all of this.
We have the two documents right on the screen here.
Okay. The risk and vulnerability report is the document I'm referring to.
Just before our next audience member, speaker, I'm not sure. What time is it? I have no idea what time it is and whether we should try to... 9:20? Okay, just so that we can make sure if there's other comments or questions, if we could keep our comments to a few minutes at most.
I certainly appreciate that, Mr. Nathan Froling. I have been trying to address the town at one of these public meetings for 2 years now. I'm sorry. My name is Kurt Griffin, and I live at Westlake Avenue. At any rate, it's nice that somebody decided to shorten the talking points. I just wanted a couple things. I remember Connecticut Realists, a small group of scientists that study climate change. I'm the author in the group, not the scientist. I'm the moderator of It's the Sun, an online international solar science forum. I've been published in the largest science blog in the world on several occasions. I was paired with Dr. Oliver Manuel, the principal NASA investigator, on a peer-reviewed paper regarding the sun, Earth's heat source. Okay, so there's a Connecticut state bill that was passed in 2012. Talks about a fair, and they changed the bill before they passed it, but originally the wording was a fair and orderly process for the withdrawal of ownership of the shoreline. Excuse me, I have asthma and a little allergies too, so I understand. That's what the bill started off as. It finished with a strategic realignment of development of the shoreline over the next several decades. I submit to you that there really is no change to the bill, they just changed the purpose of it. A lot in this report talks about more frequent and more severe storms. That's been mentioned here tonight. IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Working Group 1, Chapter 2 of the AR5 that just came out, which is the Bible of climate change, basically has said limited evidence of changes in extremes associated with other climate variables since the mid-20th century. And they continue to say the same sort of thing about tropical cyclones, hail and thunderstorms, floods, and intensity of extreme extratropical cyclones. They say that's not happening. And tornadoes have set records for absolute minimums for the lowest ever recorded for the last 3 years. The first thing I'd like to talk about, the next thing I'd like to talk about is this chart here, which it's in the appendix, and it's got 7.3 feet NAVD. Anybody in this room know what NAVD is besides the obvious people that are? No. This is a report that was set for the general public. They do not tell you what NAVD is. And they go ahead and tell you, well, the 7.3 feet, that's the high emissions 2080s scenario, okay, for no storm. And then they come back and they tell you, well, let's reduce that down to 52 inches. What does that mean? 7.3 feet NAVD, North American Vertical Datum, is actually a level of sea level. Compared to today, it's 36 inches less than 7.3 feet, which comes out to, ta-da, 52 inches. Just an example. That is deception, obfuscation at best. This paper here, excuse me, which I think somebody here will recognize it. Developing a regional framework for assessing coastal vulnerability to sea level rise in southern New England. You recognize that? I'm sure? Yep. Okay. In it, Dr. Welchel describes the process by which you use a Connecticut elevation data set and the error function associated with that data set to determine the vulnerability of shoreline properties. The problem is that the Connecticut, what they call LIDAR, has a huge error. And if you look at the 95% confidence band, we're talking 108 inches from the low to the high. Now, Dr. Welchel, we appreciate this. And by the way, this is an excellent paper, well written, and it tells you exactly what happened. And I found it very interesting and it's useful. However, when you calculate the error minus a correction factor for the NAVD and the mean high water, you end up with a high level at what he used was a 67% confidence band, plus or minus 1 standard deviation, essentially, of 52 inches. And the low in this report is minus 1 inch. In our Guilford report, and it just so happens, and I guess when you factor in 7 global climate models coupled with historic tide gauge subsidence rates, and I will, and several other variables, you must come up with 52 inches. I guess this isn't what it is. I don't know what the answer is, but there's a heck of a coincidence here. What I don't understand is why the minus 1 inch didn't end up coming out in the Guilford report. Instead, we ended up with 18.5. So, at any rate, I think the NAVD chart should come out of the report. It serves no value. It's the same as the rest of the charts that are in there concerning where they talk about the number of inches predicted. And Thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it.
Hi, my name's Ian Phillips. I'm at 52 Seaside Avenue. I'm one of those people who bought in late June. I'm sorry, I bought my property in late June of this year and didn't even know about this meeting, quite honestly, until someone from one of my neighbors came by and dropped it in my lap on a Sunday morning. I do feel that, that I know I bought on in overlooking Long Island Sound, and I'm not unaware of the fact that I'm tempting fate by staring at the water. However, I do feel that the plan is, I think if this has been in the works for 4 years and was presented a year ago, that properties being sold and bought and developed during this time period was kind of irresponsible on the part of the town, irresponsible on the seller's part if in fact they knew about it. And it's going to open a can of worms because I'm dismayed over the fact that this plan has effectively rendered my property valueless. I cannot sell it. I don't think so. I mean, I'm not planning on doing so. But you don't buy a piece of property for a certain price and then find out 3 months later that, oh, by the way, the town's planning on doing some condemnation, whatever the plan might be. And that's about it. So I just think that having the town permit sales, development, all that stuff, if one hand doesn't know what the other hand is doing, then perhaps they should get together. And that's it. Thanks so much.
Just want to underscore again, there's no condemnation contemplated at all. Giordano, do you have any other comments you want to add to that? Okay, but point understood. It's funny you should say that because I think that has been one of the challenges in this process. We know that what we're talking about is potentially a concern to prospective buyers. We've had a lot of public meetings, but meanwhile this is still just a planning process, and it's trying to make the very beginning steps toward awareness that you're talking about you wish was more widespread and available, but we're way before that, really. I mean, there's no vehicle at this point to do, I think, exactly what you're saying, but it's important what you're saying. So, another comment or question? Come on up.
My name is Alan Brown. I'm with the Hazardous Mitigation Committee formed by the First Selectman, and I just wanted to say that somebody brought up tonight that they thought that the town should see if we can get different groups in your different areas to get together and then see if you can't come to some of these meetings. We would love to have you come to our meetings. We have them once a month. We basically were designated with a list. We came up with a list of over 50 different areas that needed to be, different projects that needed to be addressed. And what we need is, we need you people to come in as a group, or with one of the head of your groups, to come in and tell us your problems and let us work on it. That's what we're there for. And we seem to be just starting out, but we work every month, and we work diligently. We need your help. We need your help to help you. So if you can get groups together and come as a group or come with just one of your people, we would love to have you. Anything we can do to help you, we will try to do it. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Mary Jo Kessner. I live at 131 Boston Street. I'm here as co-chair of the Plan of Conservation Development Update Committee, and I've also been a part of this process. And I wanted to say thank you to so many of you who have come out tonight and been involved in the process over the last 4+ years. And I also wanted to say that I think the discussion tonight points to the importance of the Planning and Zoning Commission adopting this plan. This is a huge issue for the town. It's one of the primary things that came out when people say, what is different from the 2002 plan? And it's that we had Sandy and Irene, and we have coastal flooding. We have issues where emergency services cannot get to people. And although we were all impacted by power outages that were 10 days or more, it's a little different to be not able to access your house for 10 days or more. And so I think that we really owe it to our residents of the shoreline to take their needs particularly seriously. And also to Sid Gale's point, although it's difficult to quantify the value, I think you'll find in the report that there's an assessed value and a mill rate, and essentially we're talking about a revenue to the town of $15 million for the properties that may be affected by sea level rise and coastal storms. So I thank you for having the public hearing tonight, and I hope for your support. Thank you.
Anyone else want to make a comment or raise a question?
Could I ask a couple questions? One of the things I didn't hear in the plan is when you're talking about infrastructure, if we assume your numbers are correct, wouldn't that put the railroad tracks underwater?
You're saying this
Just-
otherwise, the picture otherwise? The railroad tracks?
No, I don't think.
No, I don't think so, and can confirm that, but no.
Okay, so that becomes another dam, so to speak.
So to speak.
Okay. The second question I had had to do with water supply. Not only water supply, but fuel. And I don't know, because I live in North Guilford, but do these areas of town have natural gas now as a source of heat in their homes?
Some of them do.
So shouldn't there be something in this plan that has to do with, it seems to me there's certainly, I mean, if a house rips off its foundation and it's being fed by natural gas, there's really an exposure there, and yet there's nothing in this plan that I see that has to do with how would we deal with the infrastructures for those houses that are like that.
That's a good question. It's not, and I think Kevin alluded to it before. We talked about building code. One set of recommendations for revisions to our codes relates to building codes and relates to utilities associated with properties that are in areas that might be subject to flooding. And we don't have any specific recommendations for building code modifications, but we do recognize in the plan that that's an area where future work needs to be done. Almost everything that we've talked about here are places where are areas of interest that require more work, including better analysis of what the economic impacts are going to be, including more details about building code building code requirements with respect to propane. Propane storage is another good example. Many homes are using propane as their fuel source, and that's something that needs to be addressed if it isn't adequately now in the building code. So the gist of this plan is to identify those areas of activity where that type of additional work needs to be done, and then put in place, one of the things we haven't really talked about very much here tonight, put in place a mechanism for implementing this plan. Obviously, just to approve it and put it on a shelf somewhere doesn't advance any of the interests that are part of this plan. You've heard alluded to a couple of options about implementing the plan. Clearly, those things that relate to zoning are under the responsibility of the Planning and Zoning Commission to implement. The Board of Selectmen have the responsibility of implementing the public improvements, the infrastructure improvements that are recommended in the plan. But we envision and talk about either designating the Hazard Mitigation Commission as the implementing agency for this plan, overseeing it and looking to prioritize those elements that need to be prioritized, or, as somebody has suggested, creating a new town commission or agency with the responsibility of implementing the plan, having neighborhood representatives. You heard one recommendation tonight that all the neighborhoods, all our coastal neighborhoods be recognized and made a part of some new town agency or commission that has the responsibility of implementing the plan. These are all things that need to happen down the road, but I would repeat the point I made before. Before we can do any of those things, we have to establish the policy that this is an issue. There are a huge number of things that we can do to address the issue. They're itemized in great detail in this plan. It doesn't mean that any one of them or all of them are going to happen. None of them will happen automatically. They're not requirements. They're suggestions for future action to address this big issue. And the next step in addressing it is to create this policy document and make it the official policy of the town.
I just quick addition on that is that when we did the first part, which is the risks and vulnerabilities, we were looking at much more detail of certain places that would be potentially vulnerable, including utilities. You're talking about propane, but there are other utilities as well that may be at issue that are sort of larger public infrastructure utility issues as opposed to individual homeowners. But good point, it's one of other concerns, and again, the plan is really trying to say, let's get started in looking at these things and being better prepared than we are today. Are you leaving, or are you, okay?
I'm leaving this.
Okay. I think we're all about to follow you.
Could I ask about your model?
Yes.
Are there competing models out there? I mean, this is a nature conservancy model. Are there other models out there that
I'm going to actually try to address that, and then I may ask Adam to address that as well. There are a lot of models out there that are predicting sea level rise, and there are general numbers in terms of what the general predictions are. And again, there's the high, the medium, the low. No one really knows. Obviously, the more emissions there are, the more we're expecting to see greater sea level rise. What we did here was to bring Columbia University, NASA Goddard, and NOAA together to take those general models and to make them even more specific for Long Island Sound. And so what we've done is simply take that information and make it relevant more locally. But I think further information that's come out has substantiated the general predictions of in the neighborhood of what, the 4.5 feet or whatever, the 52, something above a meter for that kind of time horizon. So ours is one of many, but it's not by any means an outlier by any means. Did you want to answer?
I just want to add one more thing about the elevation data and make it pass a point that the recent Board of Selectmen meeting a couple of meetings ago, the town is working with state agencies, actually federal agencies. We're trying to obtain a tide gauge for the town of Guilford, possibly at the Guilford Harbor, so we can actually start our own monitoring, so we can look at our long-term data. Right now, we have data being provided by outside sources, but the hope is that we can also kind of keep an eye on our local levels. But for planning processes, which is these reports are, is you have to have some number to look at. And also look at, as been described before, is we know these areas flood during heavy storms, and we should prepare for these heavy storms. And by preparing for these heavy storms, if the tide predictions come correct, our houses and infrastructure would be kept equal to those times. But I think our biggest and current concerns is actually our access issues. And by taking care of some of these access issues, we may be also taking care of sea level rise in the future.
Did you?
I have more, but I think we're probably going to have more hearings, so.
Do you want to come up?
Quick question. What happens now? Does this now go before the Board of Selectmen to be approved or disapproved? Is there more conversation on this?
I think that's in the hands of the Planning and Zoning Commission to answer that. I mean, this is a public hearing, which...
My name is Carol Kelleher, and I live in Mulberry Point. And a couple of months ago, there was a proposal before the Planning and Zoning Commission for a piece of property right next to mine. And that land has now been approved to have a residence put on it. And as it was being proposed, some of the members on the board said, "Where is that piece of property? How close is it to Mulberry Point Road?" And I think that property acts as a buffer for my property. It holds some water when the meadow floods, which is right next to me. And now that that land has been cleared, more water will be coming to my house, probably flooding my basement. And I think it's irresponsible for the Planning and Zoning Commission, who are hearing proposals for properties next to salt marshes, who should be designated perhaps as a buffer area, to not even go and see that property before they vote on whether or not it should be approved for a building lot. And those comments were made at that meeting. And I think it doesn't help if one person from the committee goes to see these sensitive areas. I think if you're going to have the prestige of being on that committee and deciding what's going to happen to the people who live in that area, I think you have the responsibility to at least look at the property, see how close it is to a marsh, see how close it is to the tidal wetlands. They've already talked tonight about the marshlands increasing in area to upland areas. And one person who owns that marsh brought that point up at the meeting and said, "How do you know that the marsh hasn't increased in size?" But nobody paid any attention to that. And everybody has all these plans for Guilford, but yet when someone wants to build, it seems that the only thing the town of Guilford wants are more tax dollars, and they approve it. And Mulberry Point has no town water. We have many wells that are in dire straits, and the last thing we need down there is another sanitary system on a fragile piece of land, and yet it's approved anyway. So I just think, I think it's inconsistent, and I probably will regret saying this, but that's the way I feel. Thank you.
I'd like to use those comments as a segue into repeating something that was said before, and this is probably not something the Planning and Zoning Commission really needs to hear, but that the basis on which we make new zoning changes is a plan. If we want to make changes in our zoning code with respect to regulating development in areas that are potentially impacted by sea level rise or by other phenomena that are addressed in this plan, it helps to have that policy enunciated in an official document. It makes the justification for those zoning changes more meaningful. Those zoning changes are not based on an ad hoc consideration. They're based on a planned approach to protecting resources or enhancing development or whatever the planning strategy might be. One of the most significant parts of this coastal resilience plan is its suggestion that coastal resiliency is really a neighborhood-specific issue and consideration. Each of these coastal neighborhoods is different. Neck Road is different from Seaside, which is different than Mulberry, different than Indian Cove, Sachem's Head, Old Quarry, etc. And I'm not suggesting that every coastal neighborhood should follow in the footsteps of Old Quarry and Sachem's Head and have their own zoning, but I am suggesting that each of them is unique, and especially with regard to these very fine-grained changes that we're talking about, measurements of sea level rise in terms of inches and feet. Each neighborhood is different, and that zoning changes should be developed at the neighborhood level if there are any required, and that should be the basis upon which new zoning provisions are created. So this plan enables and challenges us, as I said before, to do this neighborhood-based planning, to work with the neighborhoods, to come up with plans that will preserve and protect the characteristics that they have, that they want preserved, and enhance the property values, and understand what its potentially going to happen in terms of sea level rise. I mean, we can all hope, as one of our earlier speakers did, and I certainly hope that none of these changes come about. But if we acted like we don't know about these possible changes, that would not be responsible. We would not be doing our jobs as planners, in my opinion.
I'm willing to stay all night if you want to, but you might be at the end. But certainly another opportunity for question or comment.
I think I can speak from here.
Yeah, maybe that's...
Teacher,
Yeah.
and I can...
Can you just state your name?
Nancy Arnold, Lower Whitfield Street. I'm here for 50 years, and sometimes in the water, and sometimes on the water at the bottom of Whitfield Street. I have been working peripherally with these groups for the last 10 years. Let's move it tonight, please, planning and zoning, and get it to the selectmen. This has got to stop. It's got to go on. We have lots of things we agree on, and we have lots of things we don't agree on, but we're not going anywhere. 10 years of my life, I beg you. End this one.
I take it as a suggestion to approve the plan? Okay. All right. I'm going to hand it back to you.
All right, good.
Thank you so much.
This is very exciting. It was very good. A lot of information. Last chance. Anyone want to say anything else? Your opportunity. No? Guys, we have any questions? We're all set. So our own rules and regulations require us to have a waiting period, I believe, of at least one more meeting before we can consider accepting it. So as much as we may want to or not want to accept it right now, we don't have that ability to do it unless we wait for one more meeting to make sure, give one last chance for everyone in the town, everybody, to make sure they know. Because this is a fairly big deal, and we want to make sure that, no one comes back and says, well, gee, I didn't know. So,
Maybe if I could make a procedural suggestion, Mr. Chairman, that you move to continue this hearing to your first meeting in January, and also invite anyone who has any, especially written communications with regard to this topic, to get them to us by then, and that way we can continue to accept comment and questions. We have 2 written communications that we received already. One was from a resident on Seaside Avenue. It's a multi-page document, which I'll submit to you. We also have a letter from John Goucher of the Office of Long Island Sound Programs, indicating to us that this plan is consistent with the Connecticut Coastal Management Act. It's a multi-page letter, which I'll make available to all the commission members and to the public. But I would recommend you continue this hearing to January
what's the day?
7?
January 7th. All right, so
That's
just to reiterate,
2015.
if anyone in the town wants to have any written communication in our hands, send it to Mr. Crowell, and he'll make sure we get it, and we'll use that as part of our decisioning process. I would ask for a motion from one of the members to continue this to our January 7th meeting.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All right, do we have any other business before us right now? Can I have a motion? Do we close it, or do we table, or do we continue? No, we're going to continue. All right, so we already have the motion to continue. All right, so there's no more business in front of us. I would ask for a motion to end this meeting. All those in favor? Aye. Thank you so much, everybody.